The Interesting Life of Olaudah Equiano. I am going to continue. This is part 2 with the kidnap section, and we're going to move then on to life on the slave ship. And I'm starting a little bit ahead where I ended. I'm going to be starting around line 134. I had been about 2 or 3 days at his house when a wealthy widow, a neighbor of his, came there one evening, and brought with her an only son, a young gentleman about my own age and size. Here they saw me, and having taken a fancy to me, I was bought of the merchant and went home with them. Her house and premises were situated close to one of those rivulets I had mentioned, and were the finest I ever saw in Africa. They were very extensive, and she had a number of slaves to attend her. The next day I was washed and perfumed, and when mealtime came I was led into the presence of my mistress, and ate and drank with her and her son. This filled me with astonishment, and I could scarce help expressing my surprise that the young gentleman should suffer me, who was bound to eat with him, and who was free. And not only so, but that he would not at any time either eat or drink till I had taken first, because I was the eldest, which is agreeable to our custom. Indeed, everything there, and all their treatment of me, made me forget that I was a slave. The language of these people resembled ours so nearly that we understood each other perfectly. They had also had several very same customs as we. There were likewise slaves daily to attend us, while my young master and I, with other boys, sported with our darts and bows and arrows as I had been used to at home. In this resemblance to my former happy state, I passed about 2 months, and I now began to think I was to be adopted into the family, and that was beginning to be reconciled to my situation, and to forget by degrees my misfortune, when all at once the delusions vanished, and for without the least previous knowledge, one early morning, while my dear master and companion was still asleep, I was wakened out of my reverie to fresh sorrow and hurried away, even amongst the uncircumcised. So, in other words, he is bought by a widow and her son. He is treated as an equal to the son, to the point where he ate with the family, and the son, who is younger than Olaudah, would wait until Olaudah had finished eating before he would eat, and that is the custom in honoring the eldest of the family. And so he got to the point where he thought maybe he was going to be adopted into this family, when his hopes were dashed, and he is once again taken into bondage, away from a comfortable setting. Thus, at the very moment I dreamed of the greatest happiness, I found myself most miserable, and it seemed as if fortune wished to give me this taste of joy only to render the reverse more poignant. The change I now experienced was as painful as it was sudden and unexpected. It was a change indeed from a state of bliss to a scene which is inexpressible to me, as it discovered to me an element I had never before beheld until there had no idea of, and wherein such instances of hardship and cruelty continually occurred as I can never reflect on but with horror. So he went from a state of bliss and happiness and hope to one of horror and degradation. So here we go. The slave ship. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions, too differing so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which is very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears of the moment, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country. In other words, he's taken on board the ship, he's treated roughly to see if he was sound, and he has never seen white people before with straight white hair. And their language is incomprehensible to him. He has no idea what they're saying to him. So he believes that he has fallen into the world of bad spirits, and he was afraid for his own life at this point, and that he would have exchanged everything in order for him perhaps to go and be treated as a slave in his own land, because the slaves there were still treated humanely. When I looked around the ship, too, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling with a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I was no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish. I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me, who I believe were some of those who had brought me on board and had been receiving their pay. They talked to me in order to cheer me, but all in vain. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. They told me I was not, and one of the crew brought me a small portion of spirituous liquor in a wine glass, but I was afraid of him, and I would not take it out of his hand. One of the blacks therefore took it from him and gave it to me, and I took a little down my palate, which indeed, instead of reviving me, as they thought it would, threw me into the greatest consternation at the strange feeling it produced, having never tasted such any liquor before. Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off and left me abandoned in despair. And the word consternation, it means confusion resulted from fear or shock. And he has received a very major shock and fear. And so, of course, consternation fits quite well with this line. They threw me into the greatest consternation at the strange feeling it produced. He had never had liquor before. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore which I now considered as friendly. And I even wished for my former slavery, in preference to my present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind. Still heightened by my ignorance of what I was to undergo, I was not long suffered to indulge my grief. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation to my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, two of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. The word flogged means to whip. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared the element the first time I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. This, indeed, was often the case with myself. In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation, which in a small degree gave ease to my mind. I inquired of these what was to be done with us. They gave me to understand that we were to be carried to these white people's country to work for them. I then was a little revived, and thought if it were no worse than working, my situation was not so desperate. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among my own people such instances of brutal cruelty. And this not only shown toward us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw, when we were permitted to be on deck, flog so unmercifully that a large rope near the foremast that he died in consequence of it, and they tossed him over the sides as they would have done a brute. This made me fear these people the more, and I expect nothing less than to be treated in the same manner. I could not help expressing my fears and my apprehensions to some of my countrymen. I asked them if these people had no country, but lived in this hollow space, the ship. They told me they did not, but came from a distant one. Then, said I, how comes it in all our country we'd never heard of them? They told me because they lived so far off. I then asked where were their women. Had they any like themselves? I was told they had. And why, said I, do we not see them? They answered, because they were left behind. I asked how the vessel could go. They told me they could not tell, but there were cloths put upon the mast by the help of the ropes I saw, and the vessel went on, and the white men had some spell or magic they put in the water when they liked to stop in order to stop the vessel. I was exceedingly amazed at this account, and I really thought they were spirits. I therefore wished much to be from amongst them, for I expected they would sacrifice me, and my wishes were in vain, for we were so quartered that it was impossible for any of us to make our escape. So in other words, this is so horrible to him that he considered killing himself in some fashion and to throw himself overboard, but he was prevented from doing so by the netting that surrounds the ship. He refused to eat. He did resist, and he refused to eat, preferring death to what was going on, and they flogged him. They beat him into submission so that he would eat. While we stayed on the coast, I was mostly on deck, and one day, to my great astonishment, I saw one of these vessels coming in with the sails up. As soon as the whites saw it, they gave a great shout, at which we were amazed, and more so as the vessel appeared larger by approaching nearer. At last she came to an anchor in my sight, and when the anchor was let go, I and my countrymen who saw it were lost in astonishment to observe the vessel stop, and were now convinced it was done by magic. Soon after this, the other ship got her boats out, and they came on board of us, and the people of both ships seemed very glad to see each other. Several of the strangers also shook hands with us black people, and made motions with their hands signifying, I suppose, that we were to go to their country, but we did not understand them. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fanciful noises, and we were put under deck so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrows. The stench of the hold, while we were on the coast, was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. That means really disease-ridden. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each of us had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced a copious perspiration, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration. That means for breathing, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. The term improvident avarice means careless greed. So the ship owners and the sailors, they were so careless in their greed that they didn't care how many of the blacks would die below deck. And they lost a lot of income by each black that dies, but that didn't matter. Everyone had to be in the hold below deck, and it was a very unhealthy place. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and with the filth and unnecessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable.